Hi guys! Today's video is all about Sgraffito. I recently made these planter pots and I decorated them using a technique called Sgraffito. Sgraffito comes from an Italian word meaning to scratch. It involves putting down a layer of color, either underglaze or colored slip, on unfired leather hard pots, and then carving or scratching through it to reveal the clay color underneath and creating patterns and designs. It's a really great way to add interest to a pottery piece, and it turns out really bold and awesome. I added blue or red underglaze to the outside of the freshly trimmed pots, including the bottom of the pots. Glaze will stick to kiln shelves, but underglaze does not, so I can underglaze the whole piece if I wanted to. But since these are for plants, I'm leaving most of the inside unglazed and undecorated, as it won't show once a plant is planted in the pots. I added drainage holes in the bottom of the pot and did cutouts around the base of the planter for drainage. I also made plates to go with each pot so the water has somewhere to drain too. I did cutouts and a line of underglaze on the rim of the plates for decoration, and so they coordinate with the planters. I decided not to do any Sgraffito on the plates. I'll leave them unglazed except for the underglazed part on the rim. I enjoy the contrast between glazed and unglazed parts, and a planter is a great place to leave parts unglazed as no one is eating off of these. I do, however, have lots of great pots that are designed for eating off of, like plates, mugs, and bowls, and you can check those out on my website. The link is in the description. For the first planter, I looked at the blue underglaze and thought of the ocean. I studied a lot of marine biology at university, so my brain goes to the ocean a lot. I went with a scale pattern like a fish or even a mermaid type look. This was very simple. I just carved a row of curved lines for scales, and then on the following row, I made the scales go between the previous row of scales, and I built up the pattern that way. It's a simple repeating pattern, but it adds big impact to the pot. Right now, the underglaze is muted and the clay is gray, but once fired, the clay will be close to white and the underglaze will be very bright. So these pots will have much more contrast between the clay and the underglaze when they're done. For this next pot, I decided to go with a more geometric look. Since I'd already added drainage cutouts on the base, it was easy to draw lines evenly based on those. I started by adding vertical lines at the drainage cutouts, then halfway between them, and then halfway between those marks as well. After I got all the vertical lines in place, I started doing diagonal lines. Since I divided the pot into an even number of spaces, I was able to do a pattern where I alternated the directions of the lines to create a fun up and down look with the lines. I've done this pattern several times in the past, and it always comes out looking so striking. I do eyeball the measurements and freehand the lines. I guess the drawback to Sgraffito is that if you make a mark by mistake, it is pretty obvious. So if you try this technique, just go at it confidently, and it's probably a good idea to try a test piece first. Then it was on to the red planter pots. I started this one by adding some horizontal lines around the whole pot. After that, I added vertical lines in the same way I did with the last planter. Once I had all the dividing lines set, it was time for more lines! I took this one section at a time, doing diagonal lines in every other box that I created with the horizontal and vertical lines. Then on the next row, I continued the pattern, but this time offset of the first row. After getting every other box filled in with horizontal stripes all over the pot in a checkerboard pattern, I decided to fill in the other boxes with vertical or horizontal lines on every other row. I like that this adds more variety than just doing vertical or just horizontal lines. It's a fun pattern, and I really like how it turned out. Then, after all those lines, I decided to do the next one more freeform. I think freeform or organic patterns are a bit easier to get looking good as they don't have a set pattern to follow, and it's just fun essentially doodling on pots. I started this one with a set of 3 vertical curvy lines coming down the drainage cutouts and halfway between the cutouts as well. Then, in the uncarved spaces between, I added sets of curved lines. These lines really have no set rhyme or reason to them. They're just a set of 3 lines or 10 lines, they're short or they're long. The goal here is to keep them fairly evenly spaced and just fill in the uncarved areas. I especially like doing this type of carving as it can turn out a bunch of different ways and still look really good. And for the final pot, I decided to carve flowers on it, including flowers on the base. I like how carved flowers look, and I like red flowers, so this was a good way to go. I added dots for the flower centers and then put petals coming off of that. I repeated the flowers all over the pot, working towards even coverage and somewhat random placement. I also went back and added more dots to break up the uncarved parts and add more variety. It was very simple to do little freehand flowers, but it looks great and will look even better once it's fired. I'm really happy with how all these pots turned out. I'm not really sure I could pick a favorite. Maybe the freehand Kirby lines one. Which pot do you like best? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. So I just raw glazed these pots yesterday, meaning I added glaze to them without firing them first. Normally I fire everything twice and glaze them between the two firings, but I wanted to experiment with single firing, so I glazed these with clear glaze once they were fully dry, and I'll be glaze firing them in the near future. So look for these in a future kiln unloading in the coming weeks. And while you do have to wait to see the final results of these, you don't have to wait to see how I made these awesome oil lamps. So check out that video next, and thanks for watching.